On the night of the first frost, 2 apples waited beside the tavern fire. They rested in a shallow brown dish upon the corner of the hearth, close enough to the warmth that their skins had begun to shine. One was round and red, with a blush as deep as mulled wine. The other was narrow at the base and pale gold at the crown. No sensible person, seeing them apart, would have guessed they had anything in common beyond the season in which they ripened. Yet the traveler who had brought them swore that both had grown upon the same tree. He had arrived after sunset, with frost caught in the shoulders of his cloak. He asked for stew, bread, and a place near the wall where the wind could not find him. Only when his hands had warmed around a cup did he take the apples from his pack and set them on the counter. The innkeeper turned each one beneath the lantern light. A carter said the traveler had confused his baskets. A wool merchant suggested that the tree stood too close to a monastery and had learned dishonesty from listening through the wall. That earned a few quiet laughs, for the merchant had been disputing a toll with an abbey steward all afternoon. But the traveler only smiled. "Same branch?" someone asked. "Not the same branch," he replied. "The same root." The apples gave off the first warm scent of sweetness as their skins tightened near the fire. There are trees that belong to a field, and fields that belong to a lord. There are walls that tell a man where his authority ends, and gates that remind everyone else where it begins. Those arrangements make ledgers easier to keep. But now and then, an old thing survives from a time when the lines were drawn differently, and it waits for someone patient enough to understand what it was made to do. The 2 apples beside our fire had come from such a tree. And if you have time before the frost melts from your boots, I can tell you of the woman who nearly lost the orchard where it grew, because she had spent half her life believing that the only way to keep a place safe was to make it her own. Her name was Mara Vale, and before sunrise. Each morning she walked beyond the walls of St. Aura. The abbey stood upon a broad hill where the northern road divided. Its walls were built of grey stone, square and practical, without the towers that adorned richer monasteries. In summer, wild thyme grew between the lower blocks. In winter, snow gathered beneath the narrow windows and remained there after the open fields had begun to thaw. The orchard lay outside the western wall. That detail mattered to Mara, though she could not have said why. The bakery, brewery, dovecote, herb garden, and goat yard were all safely enclosed. The orchard alone descended the outer slope in uneven rows, as if it had begun near the abbey and then thought better of entering. On autumn mornings, Mara carried a ladder on one shoulder and a hooked picking pole in her right hand. A canvas sack hung against her hip. She knew where the ground dipped beneath fallen leaves, which ladders favored one leg, and which trees held their apples loosely enough that a careless touch would send 3 tumbling down. She knew the trees by habits, no ledger mentioned. The first tree in the upper row flowered early and needed straw smoke beneath its branches on cold spring nights. The broad tree near the broken boundary stone leaned south but did not weaken. One old trunk produced apples so sharp that even the abbey pigs approached them with caution, yet those same fruits cooked into a sauce that required no spice but salt. A small tree near the stream bore only every other year. Mara's mother had called it a thinker. "It likes a year to consider what it has done," she used to say. Mara still answered some of the trees in her mother's voice. She had been 12 when Elin Vale first allowed her to climb above the lowest branches. She had been 16 when she learned to bind a split limb with linen, wool grease, and patience. At 23, she could judge a winter-damaged spur by touch in the dark. At 28, 5 years after her mother's death, she performed nearly every duty Elin had performed, but the abbey records still named her as a seasonal orchard hand. Mara pretended the wording did not trouble her. That morning, the first true frost had not yet come, but the air carried its warning. A thin white mist lay over the lower meadow. She climbed into the pale tree beside the stream and reached between two branches for a cluster of late apples. They came away in her palm with a soft twist. Below, Brother Thomas waited with a basket. He was the Abbey infirmarian and had reached the age when nobody knew whether he was 80 or merely looked as if he had spent 80 years worrying about other people. His robe was carefully patched at both elbows. He carried dried mint in one pocket, clean bandages in another, and apples in every remaining space whenever Mara allowed him into the orchard. "Those are for the infirmary," she called down. "Everything I take is for the infirmary." Several patches were darker, where rain had soaked the tiles. One section, near the scriptorium, sagged just enough to be visible from the orchard. During the last storm, water had entered the library passage and ruined 2 sacks of lampwick. The guest dormitory had been closed whenever clouds gathered. Everyone knew repairs were needed. No one knew how the Abbey would pay for them. Brother Thomas followed her gaze. "The prior has asked to see you after the noon bell," he said. Mara stopped with one hand upon the ladder. "About the winter stores?" "You know something," Mara said. "I know the infirmary roof did not leak last night, which was a blessing. I know there are 6 jars of dried elderberries remaining, which is 1 fewer than there should be. And I know the prior asked to see you after the noon bell. You put one behind the vinegar crock." She tried to return her attention to the harvest, but the prior's summons followed her from tree to tree. For several years, Mara had hoped St. Aura would appoint her orchard keeper. The position had never been formal when her mother held it. Elin received a cottage, a winter allowance of oats, and the right to graze 1 cow near the stream. In return, she pruned the trees, managed the harvest, oversaw cider pressing, and taught novices how not to break young branches. It was an arrangement made by conversation and renewed through custom. After Elin died, Prior Aldrin had told Mara that the Abbey accounts were being reorganized. Until that work was finished, he could promise only seasonal wages. Mara accepted because the trees could not wait for ledgers. Each year she expected the matter to be settled. Each year, another more urgent problem appeared. She had saved enough coin to repair the cottage chimney herself. She had mended the shed roof, sharpened the tools, and replaced 2 ladders with ash wood from a fallen tree. She behaved as if the place had already been entrusted to her, because she could imagine no other life. Yet whenever a merchant, steward, or visiting brother asked who kept the orchard, the answer came with a pause. "Mara Vale," they said, "Elin's daughter, the hired woman outside the wall." At noon, she washed her hands at the kitchen pump and crossed the lower court. The Abbey bell finished tolling as she entered the prior's chamber. Prior Aldrin sat behind a table covered with tiles. They were arranged in small stacks by color and size. Some had cracked corners. Others were blackened by years of chimney smoke. A carpenter's estimate lay open beside them, weighted at one end by a stone ink bottle. Brother Lucan stood near the window with a ledger tucked beneath his arm. He was the Abbey's keeper of accounts, a narrow man with neat dark hair and a voice that made even greetings sound carefully measured. Mara had never seen him climb a tree or carry a harvest basket, but she had seen him refuse payment for grain that arrived damp, and she knew the millers along the northern road did not enjoy bargaining with him. Prior Aldrin invited her to sit. Mara remained standing. Mud darkened the hem of her skirt, and she preferred not to put it on the carved chair. "You asked for me, Father Prior." "Even so, we remain short. The western slope is our only remaining holding suitable for lease." He would clear the lower rows for grazing and retain perhaps a dozen of the strongest trees near the wall. The first payment would cover the remaining repair cost. The orchard's yield has fallen for 6 consecutive years. More than a third of the fruit is too small or sour for sale. I have measured what leaves the storehouse and what coin returns. I asked you here before answering him because your mother served this orchard for many years, and because you have served it since. but Aldrin only said, "If you believe the orchard can provide a reasonable alternative, I will hear it." The Abbey's shortfall. Beside it, the cattle merchants promised payment. Mara knew at once that apples alone would not meet it. The season was late, much of the crop had been gathered, and the largest buyers had already filled their warehouses. She could sell every remaining fruit, empty the cider barrels, and strip usable wood from the fallen limbs, and still come short. Yet the thought of a stranger marking trees for the axe made refusal impossible. "Give me the month," she said. Prior Aldrin nodded. "You shall have it. Not only the sales." Brother Thomas waited beneath the gate arch with an empty basket. "Hidden bitterness?" he asked. "No," Mara said. "Nothing hidden at all." Moss covered the northern bark. Fallen fruit had gathered beneath the least favored varieties, and hornets moved sleepily among the splits. At the lower boundary, a section of stone wall had collapsed into the brambles. The stream ditch needed clearing. 2 trees had not borne fruit in 3 years. Lucan's figures had not lied. They had merely told a story Mara hated. She unfolded the paper and studied the sum again. 30 days. Mara began where her mother would have begun. She made an inventory. At dawn the next morning, she tied a bundle of wooden tags to her belt and carried ink, waxed cord, a pruning knife, and a board through the upper rows. Each tree received a number. She recorded its height, spread, visible disease, damaged branches, and estimated remaining fruit. She noted which apples were good for eating, keeping, drying, pressing, baking, or feeding to livestock. By noon, her fingers were stained with ink and apple skin. Brother Thomas came down from the infirmary with bread and cheese wrapped in cloth. "You have numbered the thinker," he observed. "Tree 42. She said trees prefer fewer rules. There are records somewhere." She stopped thinking of the trees as a single orchard and began seeing unequal histories standing side by side. Some had been planted in lines, each a measured distance from the next. Others stood in groups of 3 or 4 around older stumps. The upper trees shared broad crowns and smooth gray bark. The lower trees twisted in individual shapes, each pruned according to some long-vanished person's idea of order. On the 4th morning, Mara found a mark beneath the lichen of tree 71. She had climbed to inspect a dead spur when her boot slipped against a low swelling in the trunk. It was not a natural knot. She knelt and scraped away moss with the back of her knife. Beneath it lay a shallow carving, a circle crossed by 3 short lines. The mark had been cut many years ago. The bark had risen around it, softening the edges, but the shape remained clear. Mara traced it with one finger. It was not an abbey seal. St. Aura's sign was a lamp within an arch. She recorded the symbol beside tree 71 and continued. Tree 74 carried another mark, a small triangle with an open base. Tree 82 bore a shape like 2 hills beneath a line. On tree 90, nearly hidden by a root flare, she found the first circle again. By midday she had counted 7 different symbols. They repeated without an order she could understand. Some trees bore 1 mark, others bore 2, cut on opposite sides. The same symbol appeared among sweet apples, bitter cider fruit, early yellow apples, and late red keepers. It did not indicate variety or age. At tree 97, Mara discovered something stranger. One high branch still carried 3 pale gold apples. A lower branch held small red fruit, too firm to be the same kind. Mara climbed between them and examined the place where the red branch joined the trunk. The bark made a slight collar around it. She knew the shape. Her mother had taught her to create it on young stock. Cut the receiving wood cleanly, fit a living twig within it, bind the wound, and wait for 2 separate growths to accept each other. The red branch had been grafted. It was not unusual to graft an apple tree. Every skilled orchard keeper did it. Seed-grown apples were unpredictable, and a good variety survived only when its wood was carried onto another route. What was unusual was the age of the union. The graft had thickened until it was nearly as broad as Mara's thigh. She climbed higher. The golden branch was grafted too. So was a third limb without fruit. 3 varieties grew from one old trunk, and each union bore a small carved mark. The circle crossed by 3 lines appeared below the red branch. The open triangle appeared near the gold. Mara remained in the tree, while wind moved through the leaves around her. She had tended it for years. She had pruned water shoots from those branches, cleared caterpillar nests, gathered their apples, and never asked why one tree ripened in 3 different colors. Her mother must have known. The thought brought a sharper ache than Mara expected. Elin had explained 100 small matters. Why to prune after the worst cold? Why to leave windfall fruit for the pigs, but never beside a healthy trunk? Why a ladder should face into the crown rather than lean across it? Yet she had never spoken of the marks, or perhaps Mara had never asked. Children often mistake the knowledge around them for something that will always remain available. A mother's hands move confidently over a damaged branch, and the child watches without memorizing, because surely those hands will perform the task again, next spring. Then one spring comes without them, and every unasked question becomes a door without a latch. Mara descended and stood with her palm against the trunk. 2 apples of different colors hung above her from the same root. For the first time since leaving Prior Aldrin's chamber, the orchard seemed to be telling a story other than decline. She only had to learn how to read it. Mara found Brother Thomas in the infirmary garden, where he was lifting rosemary from a bed before the cold stiffened the soil. A novice knelt beside him with a basket, accepting each plant as solemnly as if it were a sacred relic. "Bring those to the drying room," Thomas told the boy. "Hang them separately from the feverfew, unless you want every broth we make this winter to taste like a churchyard hedge. I have seen them. Tell me what you remember." Your predecessor had tables outside the orchard shed, and the visitors laid the bundles there. Some came farther, I think. There were carts lined along the road on certain days, and children chased one another between the wheels, while the adults argued over trees. Your mother would know their names. I cannot recall one year when they all stopped. Fewer came. Then, fewer still. Roads washed out. Priors changed. Harvests were good or bad. Customs do not always end with a door closing. Sometimes the door remains open, and no one notices that it has not moved in years. I remember the open triangle because a little girl had embroidered it in blue on the cloth around her branches. She was very proud of the stitches. If these people gave the abbey a single twig, he will expect their descendants to provide a receipt. Dust rested upon the older volumes, but the table in front of Lucan was perfectly clean. Mara placed her inventory board beside his inkstand. 7 symbols, she said, carved into the trees. Brother Thomas remembers them on bundles brought through the west gate. The abbey used many marks before written records became consistent. I am explaining that availability is not the same as usefulness. Those 3 volumes, he said, pointing to a high shelf. They mention the Western holdings. Wash your hands first. Some hands were broad and graceful. Others crowded words into the margins, turning every blank space into an argument with scarcity. Mara read slowly. She was accustomed to labels, market tallies, and the brief notes her mother had kept. Abbey Latin delayed her, and older abbreviations stopped her altogether. Lucan sat across the table correcting sums from the current harvest. Whenever she encountered a passage she could not understand, he translated it without comment. At first, the records offered little. A wall rebuilt after a storm. 3 men paid for ditch work. 12 pear trees purchased from a priory to the south. A novice disciplined for taking cider after Compline. Barrels sent to Dunweld. Apples lost to hail. the symbols appeared nowhere. On the 7th evening, Mara closed a ledger hard enough to stir dust from its cover. If the marks represented payments, they would be here. You think I want the orchard cleared? Lucan turned the ledger toward her. Water stains marked several pages near the spine. This volume contains the names of 86 families who received grain after the flood 42 years ago, he said. If the ink is lost, no one will starve, but we will forget that help was given and perhaps begin believing it was never needed. I do not prefer cattle to trees, Mara. I prefer a roof to rain. The village stood where two streams joined, a mile beyond the Abbey Hill. Its cottages were built close together above the flood meadow, their gardens enclosed by woven hazel. A stone mill straddled the larger stream. The wheel turned slowly, lifting water that flashed silver before falling back into shadow. Mara carried copies of the 7 marks wrapped in oilcloth. She began at the bakehouse, where nobody recognized them. The miller's wife knew the open triangle, but believed it belonged to a family that had moved east. A cooper remembered seeing the crossed circle burned into old casks, though not for 20 years. Each answer offered a direction and then dissolved. At midday, an elderly woman selling onions beneath the market shelter looked at the symbol of 2 hills beneath a line. That is Holt's Meadow, she said. Or it was. Mind how you ask. Is Nessa Holt here? Grandmother will like you better if you say that again. Recognition followed by caution. Where did you find those? Holt's Meadow, though the meadow belongs to 3 families now. Only the upper roof and bell gable could be seen above the bare hedges. You should ask the people who own it. When? Nessa asked. In less than a month, unless I can show the orchard has another value. She took time before speaking, perhaps to decide whether Mara deserved an answer, or perhaps to shape anger that had been carried too long. My grandmother brought branches to St. Aura every 3rd spring, she said. Holt Reds from the tree her father planted when she was born. Good winter apples, hard as stones at harvest and sweet by Candlemas. She walked with other families. Each village brought its best wood. The monks grafted it, kept it safe, and sent branches back when blight or fire took a village tree. If ours failed, Vale Cross might still have fruit. The abbey had good walls, a clean cellar, and men who could write. That was the bargain. The fruit had come from all of us, and so it returned. Each spring we helped prune. Each autumn we sent hands to gather. St. Aura kept 1 share for its stores, 1 for sale, and the rest stood against need. When did it end? Then came 3 good harvests, and everyone found it easier not to argue. She asked us to return for the communal pruning. My husband was ill. My sons had their own farms. I said we had done enough for an abbey that remembered our obligations and forgot its own. Mara asked, did she keep records? That was the point, wasn't it? Perrin caught up carrying the willow switch. Tree 97, he said. Mara stopped. What about it? What do you want to know? The living layers must meet along the bark. She brought village names, an account of the old bargain, and a question Lucan had not included in his figures. Who had the orchard been meant to serve? Lucan listened while she described Nessa's story. He did not interrupt until she finished. An oral agreement made generations ago does not change the abbey's legal possession, he said. Mara pulled out the chair across from him. I know. Possibly. Kitchen issues, guest relief, winter disbursements. The categories changed with every cellarer. Farther down appeared the open triangle with a count of dried apples, barrels of mash, and 2 sacks of seed grain. Lucan. He usually marked alms with a small cross in the recipient's name. These are listed by place. They were the shape of an exchange. Lucan drew a clean sheet of parchment toward him and began making columns. For once, Mara did not object. They followed the symbols through 6 packets and 3 larger books. The old records were incomplete, but a pattern emerged. In years of ordinary harvest, St. Aura stored part of the fruit and sold part at market. In years when one village suffered frost, flood, blight, fire, or soldiers passing through, baskets flowed outward. The following spring, workers and new wood flowed back. This entry calls the orchard Custodia Pomorum, Lucan said near midnight. Custody of apples. Could that matter? It had preserved varieties, spread risk between slopes, and held food against disasters no one could predict. That value was real. It was also difficult to place in a purse. When Mara left the archive, the abbey slept. A lamp burned low before the chapel door. The western gate had been barred, so she climbed the narrow stair to the wall walk and looked down upon the orchard. Moonlight silvered the upper branches. Beyond them lay the dark folds of the 7 villages, streams, meadow, ridge, mill, and road, each invisible except for a few scattered lights. The orchard stood between them. Outside the wall, Mara thought, not excluded from the abbey, placed within reach of everyone else. The next afternoon, Perrin Holt appeared at the orchard gate with Nessa beside him. The boy carried 3 willow cuttings wrapped in wet cloth. Nessa carried a basket covered by a linen square. "He asked well," she said. Perrin tried not to look pleased. Mara took them to tree 97. She showed the old unions, the ridges where separate barks had grown together, and the village marks cut below each graft. Perrin ran his thumb near the Holt sign, but did not touch the fragile edge. "Our apple is up there. Your village sent 12 people after the summer storms." They climbed carefully and picked 1 apple from the old graft. On the ground, Mara cut both fruits across the middle. Their flesh showed the same pale green near the skin and the same 5-pointed star around the seeds. Perrin tasted a slice from each. The old one is sharper. Age changes a tree's fruit too. Once Perrin cleared the brambles, they found rotted stakes at regular intervals. Several small trees had survived among blackthorn and nettles, their trunks thin but healthy. "Rootstocks," Perrin said, using the old orchard phrase Nessa had taught him. Mara scraped the bark of the nearest sapling with her thumbnail. Green showed beneath. Each row ended near a low stone carved with one of the village marks. 7 nursery beds, 7 communities once responsible for renewing the orchard they shared. Mara stood in the fading light while Perrin moved from stone to stone, calling out the symbols. Nessa remained near the Holt row, her face turned away from both of them. "This was not charity," Mara said. "No," Nessa answered, "and it was not simply an abbey orchard. If she saved the trees by proving herself more capable than anyone else, surely Prior Aldrin would finally give her what Elin had held. But the old records offered a different truth. Her mother had never possessed the orchard. Even the abbey had not been meant to possess it in the way Mara understood possession. The place survived because no single hand could claim all its fruit, all its labor, or all its future. If Mara restored the promise honestly, she could not use it to make the orchard hers. She looked at the nursery rows and gave the only answer that would not betray what she had found. "Under all 7 marks," she said, and St. Aura's lamp beside them. Then she picked up Perrin's pruning hook and began cutting back the brambles from the Holtstone. They worked until the bell for vespers sounded from the hill. The first brambles came away easily. Beneath them, however, lay years of tangled growth. Blackthorn roots gripped the nursery banks, and nettles crowded every space where light reached the soil. Mara cut a path, while Perrin bundled the branches. Nessa cleared leaves from the old boundary stones with the side of her boot. As the work opened the ground, other traces appeared. There was a narrow channel that once carried water from the stream. Flat stones formed steps between the rows. Near the center stood a post so weathered that it broke when Perrin leaned upon it. Inside the split wood, sheltered from rain, remained the faint carving of St. Aura's lamp. Perrin set the broken pieces together on the grass. "The abbey had a row too," he said. "Not a row," Mara answered. "A place in the middle. 2 belonged to the Holt bed, 1 to Dunmare, 3 to Vale Cross, and the rest stood too far from the stones to identify. None had been grafted. They had waited through winter after winter, growing crooked beneath the thorns, with no fruit worth keeping, and no one remembering what they were for. Mara understood them better than she wished to. At the cottage that night, she lit a candle and opened the small wooden chest that had belonged to her mother. Elin's things were practical. 2 whetstones, a broken belt buckle, a linen cap, a pair of shears too worn to sharpen again, and a bundle of orchard notes tied with blue thread. Mara had read the notes many times. They contained bloom dates, cider measures, weather signs, and remedies for bark disease. Nothing mentioned the old agreement. Now she spread every scrap upon the table and read them in a new order. On the back of a list of barrel hoops, she noticed 7 small dots surrounding a square. Beside a recipe for grafting wax, Elin had written, "Holt red still sound on old western tree." One folded page contained the names of villages, followed by single words: Smoke, Wool, Carts, Lime, Ladders, Ditch, Press. They were not records of fruit varieties. They were contributions. At the bottom of that page, in writing smaller than the rest, Elin had left a sentence. An orchard kept by one household lasts 1 lifetime. An orchard kept by a promise may outlive every name upon it. Mara read it twice. For 5 years she had believed she honored her mother by trying to take her place. She had worn Elin's apron, used Elin's knife, slept beneath the roof Elin had repaired, and waited for the abbey to confirm that the life could pass from mother to daughter, like a good graft passed from tree to tree. But Elin had understood the orchard differently. Her work had not been to hold it. Her work had been to keep the unions alive until other hands returned. Mara carried the page to the abbey the next morning. She found Lucan in the old press house, counting casks. Sweet, yeasty air hung beneath the beams. The season's first cider worked quietly inside 6 oak barrels, making the wooden plugs whisper with escaping air. "How much would these earn?" Mara asked. Lucan named the expected price. "And if we pressed all the sound windfalls? What does smoke mean?" One of the beams had been braced with new timber, but the floor sloped toward a drain choked with pomace. "The old press can fill 12 barrels in 3 days if nothing breaks," Mara said. "Vale Cross has another press. Holt's Meadow has casks. Dunmare keeps sheep, so it has wool and carts. The ridge farms burn limestone. Late keepers remained in the lower trees." The bitter apples. No merchant wanted were suitable for pressing. Fallen limbs, collected and seasoned for years behind the shed, could be cut into smoking wood for kitchens and small pieces for turners. The unused storehouse near the west gate could hold village reserves if its door and shutters were repaired. Lucan calculated possible cider sales, dried fruit, vinegar, winter apples, grafting stock, and small fees from market nurseries that wanted uncommon varieties. Every total carried uncertainty. Even the most hopeful sum did not match the cattle merchant's first payment. "We cannot promise Aldrin enough coin in 30 days, Mara said. "No. He needs stone, lime, timber, transport, labor, and some coin. What if the villages provide part of them? Prior Aldrin cannot pledge Abbey land without the chapter's consent. Someone must move first." She went to listen, and listening proved slower than any harvest. Vale Cross remembered the old reserve in fragments. The cooper's father had repaired St. Aura's casks without payment during a frost year. But the cooper believed the abbey later sold the cider. The miller's wife recalled sacks of dried apples arriving when the stream flooded their grain store. She had been a child and thought the apples were a gift from St. Aura. When Mara explained that Vale Cross families had helped grow and gather them, the woman grew quiet. At Dunmare, sheep grazed upon the high notch, beneath the open triangle of two slopes. The village reeve, Oswindar, remembered no bargain and disliked agreements built upon memory. "Show me a sealed charter," he said, "and I will show it to our council." "My mother tied wool around little sticks every winter," he said. "Clean fleece, combed but not spun. She said it was for the sleeping trees. I did not." "Brother Lucan says your kiln could not fill the order in time. A table large enough for disagreement. Eastmere. Cultivated bees in straw. Skepson remembered sending hives to the orchard during bloom. Little Ash, the smallest village, had no surviving story, but its mark appeared beside ladder work in the ledgers, and its carpenter still built, ladders light enough to carry between trees. No one promised help, but each village agreed to send 2 people to an assembly at St. Aura. That alone astonished Prior Aldrin. Mara and Lucan presented their findings in his chamber after the evening meal. The tile stacks remained upon his table. A fresh crack had appeared in the plaster above the window. Lucan spoke first. He explained the distribution records, the village contributions, and the phrase describing the orchard as a guardianship. He did not exaggerate the legal force of the old wording. "It may prove custom," he said, "but not shared title. The abbey possesses the land under its foundation grant." Severin folded his hands within his sleeves. "All food given by St. Aura is an act of charity. Why did it return branches after fire and blight? A council with 1 voice from each village and 1 from St. Aura. The council decides how much fruit remains in reserve, how much may be sold, and where aid goes after a failed harvest. Every account is copied and read publicly after the season. Each village contributes work or materials according to what it can provide. St. Aura keeps the land, the storehouse, and care of the records, but it cannot lease or clear the orchard without the council's agreement. You would make abbey property answerable to farmers. Stonewake can supply lime. Millbarrow has carts. Little Ash can replace ladders, so we may sell the old ash wood and gather safely. If the reserve is restored, we can press fruit. The merchants will not buy and sell the cider without weakening winter stores. But it may reduce the immediate repair cost enough for us to meet the mason's first stage. In later years, a managed harvest and nursery sales could provide more stable income than the orchard has produced recently. His lease gives him the right to cut all but 12 trees. When it ends, St. Aura may regain exhausted ground and no orchard. When I took my vows, he said, the guest master told me that an abbey wall has 2 purposes. It keeps silence within, and it gives shelter to whoever reaches the gate. I believed both equally. In office, I have spent more time keeping rain from beds than considering what our walls mean. No lease will be signed before then. The east gutter failed this morning. Brother Thomas moved 2 patients because water entered the infirmary passage. Every delay has a cost, even when made for a good reason. It could not be held within the chapter house, because several village delegates refused to enter the cloister, and Brother Severin refused to let a market crowd occupy the monks' seats. So tables were carried beneath the gate arch. Benches came from the guest hall, and boards from the bakehouse. The meeting rested half inside and half outside the wall, which Brother Thomas called appropriate and Lucan called inconvenient. Mara arrived before dawn to place 7 baskets upon the central table. Each held apples from grafts bearing 1 village mark. Some were smooth, some russeted, some small enough to fit 3 in a hand. Beside them, she set the old distribution books and her inventory. The delegates came slowly. Nessa and Perrin represented Holt's Meadow, though Nessa insisted Perrin was there only to carry papers. Oswindar came from Dunmare with the old shepherd, whose name was Bram. Ada Fenn arrived from Stonewake with lime dust, still caught in the seams of her boots. Valecross sent the miller's wife, Lysa Bell, and the cooper. Millbarrow sent 2 sisters, who managed its press. Redbrook's ditch. Warden came with his eldest daughter. Little Ash sent its carpenter and a farmer, so shy he spoke only when directly asked. Eastmere brought a beekeeper carrying an empty straw skep as evidence that bees too deserved acknowledgement. The Abbey chapter sat opposite them. Prior Aldrin opened with a prayer, brief enough not to test anyone's patience. Then Lucan read the accounts. He did not hide St. Aura's gains. He named the years in which the Abbey had sold fruit while sending none to the villages. He also named the years when village labor failed to appear and trees went unpruned. The story of the orchard's decline belonged to no single culprit. It had been built from small withdrawals, each defensible alone, until nothing remained but legal possession and resentment. When Lucan finished, voices rose at once. Oswin demanded proof that future reserve apples would be distributed fairly. The Redbrook warden wanted assurance that ditch work counted more than a few baskets of early fruit. Ada Fenn refused to price her lime according to rates Lucan had offered in spring. Brother Severin questioned whether people who had neglected the orchard for years deserved authority over it now. Nessa answered him. "No," she said. "We do not deserve authority because our grandparents had it. Neither does St. Aura deserve trust because its earlier priors earned it. We are all here because inheritance has failed." 7. Village voices and one Abbey voice seemed unfair to Severin. 2 Abbey voices seemed unfair to Oswin. Lysa Bell suggested that decisions require 6 of 8 votes, including at least 1 from St. Aura. Ada Fenn said that would let the Abbey stop everything. Lucan proposed that ordinary harvest decisions require a majority, while sale, lease, or clearing of land require 6 voices. The Millbarrow sisters wanted written measures for reserve fruit. Bram the shepherd wanted every rule read aloud. Once a year, because a promise understood only by scribes was a poor promise. By midday, no agreement had been reached. The Abbey kitchen sent pots of barley stew into the yard. People who had spent hours disputing ownership now shared bowls because there were not enough to go around. Perrin sat beside Bram and asked about wool ties. The Eastmere beekeeper inspected the skep repairs made by Little Ash's carpenter. Lucan and Ada Fenn argued over lime in tones that gradually became less hostile and more exact. Mara carried a bowl to Nessa near the orchard gate. "You did not promise to support the plan," Mara said. "I promised to attend." Brother Thomas emerged from the gate carrying a folded message. A rider from the northern ridge had brought it from the weather watch at Stonewake. Cold air was descending from the high country. The first hard frost would arrive within 4 nights, perhaps 3. Mara looked toward the orchard. Hundreds of late apples remained on the trees. A mild frost might sweeten them. A hard one would freeze the flesh, split skins when the sun returned, and ruin most for winter storage. The assembly's careful arguments had just been given a clock. Prior Aldrin asked, "How long to gather the remaining crop?" "Dunmere has its own stores to prepare. If St. Aura does that before it knows whether enough remains for sale, Holt's Meadow will send carts on the second morning." Aldrin understood. His eyes moved from the sagging roof to the 7 baskets on the table. "The first share goes into reserve," he said. "Counted in the open, sealed by St. Aura and any village that comes to witness." Yet as the delegates departed, each took a wooden tag bearing the time of the harvest bell. That night, Mara did not sleep much. Wind moved around the cottage, carrying the dry scent of leaves. She lay beneath Elin's old wool blanket and counted possible workers, ladders, carts, sacks, casks, and hours of daylight. At some point, she realized she was making columns in her head, like Lucan. Before dawn, she rose, lit no candle, and walked to the orchard beneath a sky full of cold stars. Perrin waited by the gate. "Nessa said the second morning," Mara told him. "She said Holt's carts would come then. She did not say I had to wait." Lucan came with ink, tally boards, and a small chest fitted with 8 compartments for the village seals. Prior Aldrin brought the guest master, the cook, and 3 brothers released from other duties. They were 20 people, fewer than Mara had hoped. The harvest bell rang once. They began. Mara sent the strongest climbers to the upper rows and the novices to gather sound windfalls for pressing. Perrin worked beside her among the old grafted trees. He was quick, but reached too far from the ladder until she made him descend and place it again. "Moving takes time," he said. "Falling takes more." "Shorter," Mara told him as she passed. "Count first, describe later." Perrin pressed Holt's 2-hill seal into a piece of warm wax beside St. Aura's lamp. "I am not a delegate," he said. "Today you are a witness," Aldrin answered. The boy held the seal a moment longer before lifting it. By noon, cold cloud had covered the sun. Their hands stiffened. The guest master brought hot onion broth in a bucket and poured it into cups without asking whether anyone belonged to the abbey or a village. No carts appeared on the road. Mara kept working. At tree 97, she reached the branch carrying 2 colors of fruit. The gold apples went into one basket, the Holt reds into another. Perrin carried both to Lucan. "Same tree," he said. "Different marks," Lucan replied. "Same root. There were 23. Not enough to feed 7 villages through a failed winter. Not enough to prove the old promise restored. But they were the first fruit saint Aura had set aside, under the village marks, in more than 30 years. Lucan closed the outer door. Aldrin wound a cord through the latch. St. Aura's wax seal went on first. Perrin added Holt's. "Will your grandmother accept that?" Mara asked. "She will say I pressed too hard." The old press had jammed before filling half a cask. They had gathered less than a quarter of what remained. The frost was 2 nights away. Mara stood by the western gate as the others returned uphill. She could hear Lucan explaining to Aldrin how far the day's work had fallen below his hopeful estimate. No village had sent workers. Perrin waited beside her. "They will come tomorrow," he said. "You do not know that." She broke the fresh seals, selected 7 reserve baskets, and carried them one by one to the abbey stable. Lucan found her harnessing the smallest cart. "Those are sealed reserve fruit," he said. "They are meant for the villages. They need to know the promise has moved farther than our storehouse. We leave 1 basket, a copy of today's count, and an invitation to inspect the store." Lucan read the count by lantern light and showed her how every 5th basket had entered reserve. At Dunmare, Oswin was absent, but Bram the shepherd accepted the fruit and placed his open triangle beside the abbey seal on the copied tally. At Stonewake, Ada Fenn tasted 1 apple, declared it inferior to limestone, and promised nothing. Yet she carried the basket inside rather than leaving it at the kiln. They continued through Redbrook, Millbarrow, Eastmere, and Little Ash. At each place, Mara repeated the same words. "This is not a gift from St. Aura. It is the first return from an orchard your village helped make." Nessa opened the door, wearing a cloak over her nightdress. Perrin appeared behind her, with his hair flattened on one side. Mara set the last basket upon the threshold. "The first share has already been sealed in the storehouse," she said. "These are from that share. Lucan has the count. You are meant to keep the reserve safe, because a promise kept behind a locked door looks too much like possession." "I know." Mara slept for less than an hour on a bench in the press house, wrapped in her cloak with her boots still on. She woke to the sound of wheels. At first, she thought the noise belonged to a dream. Then came the creak of axles, the clink of harness, and a man's voice calling for the gate to be opened. Mara sat up. The eastern sky was only beginning to gray. Through the press house door, she saw 2 lanterns descending the road. Another moved behind them, and another after that. Holt's meadow arrived first. Nessa drove the leading cart. Perrin sat beside her with a bundle of picking sacks between his knees. 3 families followed on foot, carrying ladders, baskets, and pruning hooks. The young Holt tree had given them no great harvest of their own that year, but they brought every sound cask they could spare. Vale Cross came next with Lysa Bell, the cooper, the miller's apprentices, and a wagon holding their small press. The heavy screw and beam had been taken apart for transport. They intended to rebuild it beside St. Aura's old one. From the northern road appeared Dunmare's wool carts. Bram the shepherd rode in the first, surrounded by children and bundles of clean fleece. Oswindar sat stiffly in the second. He claimed he had come only to observe the count, though he wore work gloves, and had brought 6 able harvesters. Stonewake's wagon descended last, because lime travels poorly at speed. Ada Fenn walked beside it, guarding 4 covered barrels of quicklime and complaining that every rut in the Abbey road had been designed to waste her morning. Redbrook brought spades and ditch tools. Eastmere carried 2 occupied bee-skeps to place near the remaining late flowers and enough food for the workers. Little Ash arrived with 3 new ladders and a carpenter prepared to repair any old one that failed. The Milbarrow sisters brought empty cider barrels, iron fittings, and the news that their larger press could begin accepting fruit by afternoon if carts kept the road busy. The Abbey gatekeeper stared as the outer yard filled. Brother Thomas came down from the infirmary, tying his belt. "I see the promise has developed wheels." Delegates from each village crowded around the 23 remaining baskets. They examined the tags, counted the fruit, and checked his tallies against the broken seals from the previous night. Oswin questioned 3 entries. One was a copying error, which Lucan corrected without defense. The other 2 matched. When the inspection ended, Nessa placed the Holt seal in the wax beside St. Aura's. The other delegates followed. 8 marks closed the store. "Now," Nessa said, "let us gather before the weather does." At Mara's signal, they rang together, producing no melody. Anyone would call beautiful, but a cheerful confusion, loud enough to carry from the wall to the stream. Mara divided the orchard into sections. Experienced climbers took the tall trees. Children gathered only where branches could be reached from the ground. Older workers sorted fruit beneath canvas awnings. Each village sent 1 witness to Lucan's table, where the first day's crowded sheet had been replaced by simple boards. Fruit gathered, fruit reserved, fruit for storage, fruit for pressing, fruit damaged. The old divisions did not vanish. Dunmare workers distrusted the measures used by Vale Cross. The Milbarrow sisters refused to send their best barrels until Lucan agreed to count the iron hoops as part of their contribution. Brother Severin objected when village children ran beneath the cloister passage with muddy shoes. Nessa ordered them outside before he could finish, then told him the Abbey should build a wall capable of stopping mud if it wished to preserve perfect floors. Yet the work continued. Mara moved constantly. She checked ladders, assigned carts, identified fruit, settled arguments over damaged apples, and taught workers to twist rather than pull. When the Eastmere cookers began dropping from a high branch, she spread wool blankets below to soften their fall. When an axle split near the stream, Little Ash's carpenter fitted a new pin from ashwood before the horse had finished drinking. Perrin worked with the tree crews, but he returned often to the tally table. He seemed fascinated by the way Lucan transformed baskets into marks and marks into decisions. "Can a number lie?" he asked during the noon meal. Lucan considered the question more seriously than most adults would have. A number may be wrong. A person may lie with one. Most often, a number tells the truth it was asked to tell, while someone forgets to ask whether another truth matters. Like the sales ledger, workers poured chopped apples into cloths, folded them into square layers, and stacked them beneath the beam. As the screw tightened, amber juice ran into shallow tubs. The scent drew wasps from the hedges, though the cold made them slow and harmless. At Milbarrow, carts unloaded into the larger press without stopping. The sisters sent back barrels filled with fresh juice and receipts marked by both village and Abbey witnesses. Lucan had never designed an account that traveled faster than he did. By afternoon, he gave Perrin a tally stick and taught him to notch every departing cart. 1 deep cut for 10 baskets, Lucan said. 1 shallow cut for 1. Never put the 10s beside the 1s. Nessa stood beside the Holt row as the first thin stream reached it. Your mother asked me to help clear this, she told Mara. When? I told her I had waited long enough for Saint Aura to remember us. Instead, she asked, why did you come today? It asked nothing new of her. Leaves lifted from the orchard floor and traveled uphill. The temperature fell quickly enough that breath showed around the workers. Mara sent the children home and ordered every filled basket under shelter. The trees nearest the wall were nearly bare. The lower rows remained heavy. 1 more hour, Oswin called. Half, Mara answered. No ladders after the light fails. Workers gathered what they could from the ground, but many split. Brother Thomas took charge of the cold and tired. He turned the press house into a place of cups, blankets, and bandaged fingers. The novice who had twisted an ankle. The previous day sat beside the stove recording names for him. Eastmere's cooks produced a stew thick with lentils and onions. For a while, the orchard work narrowed to the ordinary comfort of hot food after labor. The delegates met over bowls near the press. They had harvested more than half the remaining fruit in one day. Another full day might finish the sound crop, but the weather message now predicted frost before the following dawn. Work through the night, Oswin said. Mara shook her head. No ladders, no high branches. We can sort and press under lanterns. At midnight, half the workers rest. At the second bell, they exchange. No one stays on a ladder. No horse travels the stream road after ice forms. Now he carried the chapter's heavy wool cloaks in his arms. These may be used by the night workers, he said. They are to be returned dry. Canvas sheets moved between the cider rows. Men and women held their edges while others shook the branches with padded hooks. Apples rained down, first in a scatter and then in a rolling weight that bowed the cloth. At the presses, wooden screws turned without rest. Juice-filled tubs and tubs-filled barrels. The cooper worked beside the Milbarrow sisters, replacing cracked hoops. Ada Fenn used hot lime to seal a leak in the press house drain. Redbrook laid straw along the slippery path. Mara spent the first watch among the lower trees. Frost formed gradually upon fallen leaves, touching their edges white. She could feel cold through the soles of her boots. Each breath sharpened the air. Near midnight, she came to tree 97. Only 4 apples remained, 2 gold and 2 red. They hung too high to reach without a ladder. Perrin, newly awake for his watch, found her looking up. We can climb, he said. No. The orchard had become precious to him quickly, and youth often believes that saving something means preventing every loss. Those 4 apples are not the tree, she said. The tree is not the orchard, and the orchard is not only what we can carry into a storehouse tonight. At the second bell, Mara returned to the press house and found Prior Aldrin turning the veil cross-screw. His robe had been tucked above his boots, and apple pulp marked one sleeve. The roof has begun leaking above my chair, he said. I judged myself more useful here. He showed Mara the totals. They had enough reserve fruit for a modest winter distribution if one village suffered loss. Enough keeping apples for Saint Aura. Enough cider and vinegar, once finished, to sell at a sum larger than Mara's first hope. The contributions of lime, carts, ladders, casks, and labor reduced the mason's required payment by nearly a third. Nearly, Mara said. Nearly, Lucan agreed. They remained short. Not disastrously short, but short enough that the first stage of roof work could cover only the infirmary and archive, leaving the guest hall until spring. Aldrin could accept that delay. The greater problem was timber for the east roof brace. The carpenter required 2 long ash beams, straight and seasoned. The cattle merchant's deposit would buy them, Aldrin said quietly. Mara thought of the wood stacked behind the orchard shed. Most pieces were short, twisted limbs useful for fuel or turning. The few straight trunks were either green or too narrow. There may be another source, she said. At dawn, while the first frost settled over St. Aura, Mara led Aldrin, Lucan, Nessa, and Little Ash's carpenter to the orchard's northern edge. 2 ash trees stood there, planted as a windbreak generations before. One was healthy. The other had lost half its crown in a storm 3 years earlier. A dark wound ran down its northern side. Mara had delayed removing it because the lower branches still shaded the sorting ground in summer. The carpenter examined the trunk. He tapped it, bored a narrow hole, and smelled the shavings. Heart is sound below the wound, he said. The main trunk could give 2 beams if it is dried standing. It belongs to the orchard shelter, Mara replied. The old rules may protect it with the rest. Mara explained the roof need, the tree's condition, and the carpenter's judgment. Some wanted to save it because no tree should be cut in the same week they came to prevent cutting. Others argued that using one failing tree to preserve the orchard and shelter the infirmary fulfilled the promise better than leaving it to rot. Perrin spoke last. If we graft a branch, the branch must be cut from one place before it can live in another, he said. That does not mean cutting is always right, but sometimes it joins 2 needs. The decision was written beneath all 8 marks. For Mara, the sound of the axe later that morning was not easy. She had feared that sound for weeks. Each blow carried across the orchard, followed by a pause while the woodcutter adjusted his cut. Workers stood clear. Ropes guided the tree away from the nearest apples. When the ash finally descended, it did not crash so much as settle through its remaining branches and come to rest upon the frost-covered ground. The carpenter counted the rings. The tree had stood for nearly a century. Mara placed one hand upon the cut stump. Loss remained loss, even when chosen well. But the trunk would cross the abbey walls as shelter. Its branches would rebuild the place where fruit was kept. 2 young ashes would take its place. Nothing had been wasted, and no one had decided alone. The first sunlight reached the orchard soon after. Every leaf shone white. Apples missed in the night wore clear beads along their lower curves. Workers walked among the trees, checking the damage. The hard frost had come, but later than feared. Most gathered fruit was safe beneath straw. Some apples on the trees had split. Others remained sound. Tree 97 stood in sunlight near the stream. Perrin reached its trunk before Mara. The 4 apples still hung in the crown. He waited for her permission before setting a ladder. The frost had begun to melt, and Mara tested every rung herself. Together, they climbed. The 2 gold apples came away firm. One red had split, but the other was whole. Perrin held the sound red apple beside a gold one. Different branches, he said. Same root, Mara replied. They carried them down and placed both in the reserve basket. By noon, the harvest was finished. The workers returned ladders, rolled canvas, and swept the press floors. Carts departed more slowly than they had arrived. Each village took a written count of its contribution and a copy of the reserve measure. None carried home more fruit than the basket. Mara and Lucan had delivered the previous night. The new agreement had not yet been sealed, and the reserve would remain under shared lock until it was. In the outer yard, the delegates met once more. This time, the discussion was shorter. Work had answered questions. Argument could not. They fixed 8 council seats. Ordinary decisions would require 5 voices. Any sale of land, long lease, large clearing, or change to the reserve would require 6, including St. Aura and at least 4 villages. Accounts would be copied to Vale Cross and read aloud at an annual gathering after harvest. Contributions could be made in labor, materials, coin, or care of specified nursery rows. Their value would be agreed before each season, not assigned afterward by Saint Aura. The orchard itself remained Abbey land, but Saint Aura acknowledged that it held the trees, fruit, and nursery in guardianship under the renewed compact. If the Abbey abandoned the reserve for 3 successive years, the villages could petition the bishop's steward to appoint another keeper. If the villages failed to meet their contributions for 3 years, Saint Aura could call a new assembly to change the compact, but not quietly erase it. Bram insisted on one final line. "Write that every child may learn which mark belongs to which village," he said. "Otherwise we will be back here when Perrin has my knees. Be one again." When he handed the pen to Mara, he said, "Guardianship will create a great deal of correspondence." It stood beneath a new title the delegates had chosen together, Guardian of the Western Orchard. For years, she had wanted words that would make the place hers. When the ink dried, she felt something quieter and larger. The title bound her to work, to accounts, to 8 voices, to villages capable of stubbornness, and to an abbey capable of forgetting. It gave her less command than she once desired. It gave the orchard a future beyond her. Prior Aldrin declined the cattle merchant's lease that afternoon. The merchant was displeased. He reminded Aldrin that promised income should not be exchanged for village enthusiasm, which cooled faster than cider in winter. Aldrin answered that no promise was secure merely because coin stood behind it. He returned the unsigned lease. Roof work began 2 days later. Stonewake's lime arrived in sealed barrels. Millbarrow carts hauled stone from the mason's yard. The old ash became 2 straight beams after Little Ash's carpenter, and the Abbey sawyers worked it upon the pit. Vale Cross supplied pegs and wedges. Saint Aura paid the mason in coin from advanced cider sales, reduced by the labor and materials recorded under the compact. The infirmary roof was closed before the next rain. The archive followed. The guest hall remained under canvas for part of the winter, but no bed stood beneath the worst leak, and Prior Aldrin decided that humility was easier to offer visitors than wet blankets. The orchard settled into its cold season. Leaves fell. The branches showed their true shapes. Fruit in the reserve store changed slowly from sharpness to sweetness. Every 10 days, 2 witnesses checked the baskets and removed anything beginning to spoil. Nothing was allowed to rot in the name of preserving it. When early snow blocked the high path to Dunmare, Saint Aura opened the reserve for the first time. The village had food, but a cart carrying winter salt and onions had overturned in the pass. The council sent dried apples, 2 barrels of roots, and enough salt from the Abbey cellar to carry Dunmare through until the road reopened. Oswin objected that the need was too small to justify a distribution. Bram reminded him that a reserve did not become wiser by waiting for suffering to deepen. The delivery was entered under the open triangle. In late winter, Mara began taking cyan wood. Perrin came before dawn on the appointed days. Together, they chose 1-year shoots from the strongest marked branches, cut them cleanly, labeled them, and wrapped them in damp cloth. They gathered Holt Red from tree 97, Dunmare Sweet from the upper row, Redbrook Green from a low tree near the stream, and 4 varieties whose village names had been lost. Those unknown branches were not discarded. The council gave them simple working names drawn from the orchard: Wall Gold, Rook Red, Streamkeeper, and Eland's Sharp. Nessa objected to the last until she tasted its sauce. At the restored nursery, each village tended its own bed and helped tend the central space. Perrin's first graft failed. His second dried at the tip. The third remained green for 3 weeks, then opened a single leaf. He ran uphill to find Mara, as if the tree had rung a bell. She followed him down at a more reasonable pace. The little leaf trembled in the spring wind. The graft union was rough, and Perrin had wrapped it with more wool than necessary, but the living layers had met. "Do not touch it," Mara said. I was not going to. Nessa arrived carrying a bucket of water. She examined the leaf, then Perrin's binding, then the expression he was trying unsuccessfully to hide. Your cut is uneven, she said. His face fell. But it took, she added. Remember why. The young tree did not belong to him alone. That did not lessen his pride in it. Spring brought other changes. The village pruning days returned, not as they had been in Thomas's youth, but in a form shaped by the people who came now. The Eastmere beekeeper placed skeps among the bloom. Dunmare brought clean wool. Redbrook finished the water channel. Little Ash built a low teaching frame where children could practice grafting on cut branches before touching living trees. Lucan hung a board inside the western storehouse, showing the orchard account in plain numbers. Beneath it, Bram placed a second board with the same information explained in words. At the annual reading, anyone could question either. Brother Severin questioned both for nearly an hour. The council learned to expect this and eventually recognized its value. Mara moved into the orchard cottage under a written appointment. The roof, chimney, cow grazing, winter oats, tools and duties were listed clearly. So were the limits of her authority. She could prune, plant, train workers, manage ordinary sales, and act in emergencies. She could not cut a marked tree, change a village's nursery row, or empty the reserve without witnesses. She read the appointment twice before signing. You wished for more freedom, Lucan guessed. I wished for certainty. I confused the two. Not framed or sealed away, but pinned where work, smoke, and weather might touch it. An orchard kept by one household lasts one lifetime. An orchard kept by a promise may outlive every name upon it. As years passed, some parts of the promise proved difficult. One summer, Redbrook sent no ditch crew because fever had entered the lower farms. The other villages took its work and asked no repayment until the following season. Another year, St. Aura wanted to sell more cider after grain prices rose. The council refused and was proved wise when early snow trapped 3 villages from market. Once, 2 nursery rows failed because everyone believed someone else had watered them. Mara recorded the failure plainly. The compact did not make people generous at every moment. It made their forgetfulness visible soon enough to correct. Tree 97 continued bearing 2 kinds of apples. The third graft, which had carried no fruit during Mara's inventory, flowered after a careful pruning. Its apples ripened pale green with a red thread near the stem. No record identified them. The villages argued pleasantly over their origin, each finding some resemblance to a fruit grown by a grandparent. Mara refused to assign the branch to any single mark. Let it belong to the root, she said. Perrin grew tall enough to reach the lower crown without a ladder. He learned to make grafts cleaner than Mara's and accounts nearly as neat as Lucan's. When travelers came to buy Scion wood, he explained that no branch left St. Aura without its village name, planting notes, and a promise that the buyer would return fresh wood if disease ever took the orchard. Some travelers laughed at the condition. Most agreed. Brother Thomas lived long enough to complain that the restored customs had created too much work for an old man. Yet each spring, he sat beside the grafting tables, telling children about bundles wrapped in wet cloth and the keeper who had once boxed his ear to save a twig. He improved the story every year. By the 5th telling, the twig had become an entire pear tree, and Keeper Sen had chased him around the abbey twice. No ledger corrected him. Prior Aldrin's roof held. Rain struck the new tiles, travelled cleanly into the gutters, and filled the courtyard cistern. From the orchard, the long ash beams could not be seen, but Mara knew where they rested above the infirmary. Along the northern boundary, 2 young ash trees grew in the shelter of the wall. When people asked whether St. Aura owned the orchard, Aldrin learned to answer carefully. We own the ground, he said. We keep the promise. The fruit knows the difference better than we do. The red one had split neatly along one side. A thread of juice glistened in the opening and darkened where it touched the brown dish. The gold apple remained whole, though its skin had softened and folded around the stem. Their scents had mingled with the wood smoke until no one in the room could have said which sweetness came from which fruit. The innkeeper drew the dish away from the coals with a long iron hook. She waited while the apples cooled, for hot fruit punishes impatience more thoroughly than any sermon. Then she cut them into small pieces and placed both kinds together upon a clean wooden plate. The carter took a red piece. The wool merchant chose gold. After tasting, each reached for the other. The traveler who had brought them watched without comment. "Did they truly grow on Mara's tree?" someone asked him. He turned his cup between his hands. "They grew in the western orchard," he said. "That is true enough. Old promises. Travel in ways that make exact answers difficult. A branch leaves one place, takes hold in another, and one winter, a traveler finds two different apples sharing a root beside the road. Outside, the frost had thickened upon the windows. The last wagon of the evening stood beneath the stable roof. Its horse rested with one hind leg bent, and every leather strap hung loose. Far along the dark road, roofs were turning white, one after another. Inside, the plate passed quietly from hand to hand. No one asked which slice belonged to the abbey, which to Holt's Meadow, or which share should have remained for sale. There was enough for everyone near the hearth to taste, and one piece left over. The innkeeper set that final piece upon the traveler's empty saucer. He did not eat it at once. He wrapped it in a square of cloth and returned it to his pack. "For tomorrow?" the carter asked. "For the seeds," the traveler said. Of course, an apple seed does not promise a fruit like the one that carried it. Plant a red apple's seed, and the tree may bear something green, small, sharp, sweet, or unlike any apple known before. To preserve a kind, the orchard keeper carries living wood. To discover what might yet grow, someone plants the seed. Both acts require hope, though not the same hope. The fire settled lower. A log broke softly in the middle and released a brief glow before folding into embers. Cups stood empty. Conversation thinned. Even the wool merchant, who had opinions ready for every abbey steward in the northern counties, leaned back against the wall and allowed the silence to remain uncorrected. Morning would melt some of the frost. It would leave other corners white until noon. Carts would continue along the road, carrying apples, wool, letters, lime, stories, and small bundles of branches wrapped in damp cloth. And somewhere beyond a gray wall, on a slope shared by bells and village paths, trees of many kinds would rest upon the same dark earth. They did not need to know every name of those who had kept them. They needed only the patient hands that would come again in spring.